My name is Carrie Carter, and I am 26 years old. I was sitting in my Aunt Rhonda's formal dining room, staring down at a 100-page commercial loan document. Across the polished mahogany table, my mother was sobbing into a tissue, begging me to sign the paper to save our family from financial ruin. She was lying. I knew for a fact that if I dragged the silver pen across that signature line, I would instantly lose $10 million of inherited Wyoming basin land to my cousin's bankrupt husband. Before I tell you how I walked out of that room and watched their entire high society facade crumble to dust, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Grape Echo Stories, but only if you genuinely connect with this kind of truth. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. Let me take you back 6 months to the exact moment I realized I meant absolutely nothing to them. It was a sweltering May afternoon in Laramie. The university arena smelled intensely of floor wax and cheap grocery store bouquets. I sat in a sea of black graduation gowns, with my hands resting heavily in my lap. My palms were calloused from weeks of field sampling in the Wind River Range, but I had scrubbed them raw for today. I scanned section 114, row F, seats 12 and 13. They remained completely vacant. The commencement speaker droned on about uncharted frontiers, while my pulse tapped a hollow rhythm against my ribs. The dean stepped up to the microphone and adjusted the stand. Carrie Carter. Just as the syllables echoed through the overhead speakers, my phone buzzed against my leg. I pulled it out from under my robe. The bright screen glared in the dim auditorium light, displaying a single new message from my mother, Joanne. We went to Kinsley's gender reveal instead. It is just a diploma. This is a baby. I did not gasp. I just gripped the plastic edge of my folding chair until my knuckles turned white. I stood up, smoothed the front of my gown, and climbed the carpeted stairs. I grasped the leather folder, shook the dean's hand, and forced a smile for the flash of a hired camera meant to capture a milestone my own bloodline could not be bothered to witness. Hours later, the shadows stretched long across the bare walls of my studio apartment in Casper. I sat on my thrifted sofa, listening to the high plains wind rattling the window panes. My phone illuminated the dark room with bursts of pink and blue confetti on my social media feed. There was my cousin Kinsley glowing in a designer maternity dress. There was my father holding a frosted cupcake. Joanne had tagged the location at an upscale country club, proudly bragging about a $5,000 party package. They were celebrating a fetus while entirely erasing 2 years of my grueling academic labor. I set the phone face down on the coffee table. The hollow ache tried to settle in my throat, but I forced it down. No tears came. Instead, a quiet, freezing resolve took root in my chest, settling deep and hard like the bedrock I studied. 2 days passed. The air in my apartment felt stale thick with the unspoken realization that my absence at their country club spectacle had not even registered on their radar. I was sitting at my kitchen island nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee when my phone lit up. It was not an apology. It was a text from Aunt Rhonda. The screen glared with her pristine entitlement. Carrie, since you chose to skip family obligations on Saturday, Kinsley is feeling very hurt. We expect you to purchase the imported European stroller from her registry to make up for your absence. I clicked the link she provided. $800. The sheer audacity hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath right out of my lungs. They skipped the culmination of my academic career for a slice of blue cake, and now they wanted me to finance a luxury baby carriage as penance for my own neglect. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. For 26 years, I had been trained to smooth things over. I had been taught to apologize for taking up space, to buy their conditional affection with quiet obedience. My chest tightened until it ached. I looked at the framed Master of Science diploma resting on the counter waiting to be hung on the wall. I thought about the late nights, studying the freezing field trips, the loans I had taken out to pay for it all. I deleted the 3 paragraphs of careful justification I had instinctively drafted. I typed 2 letters. No. I hit send. It was the first boundary I ever drew in my entire life. The retaliation was instantaneous. Less than 3 minutes later, my phone vibrated so hard it rattled against the cheap laminate countertop. Caller ID flashed my father's name. I answered, bracing for the impact. Joanne's voice shrieked through the speaker before I could even utter a greeting. "How dare you speak to your aunt that way? You are a selfish, ungrateful girl." I pressed the phone closer to my ear, letting the venom pour over me. I tried to explain that I was paying off student loans, that I could not afford an $800 apology for a party I was never even invited to. I tried to remind them that I had just graduated. Then Dennis snatched the receiver. His voice was cold, dripping with the kind of condescension he reserved exclusively for me. "You think you are so superior now because you have a piece of paper, Carrie. Geology is not a real career. You play with useless dirt. You dig in the mud while your cousin is building an actual legacy." He laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut straight through the static. "You are going to end up alone, out in the middle of nowhere, with nothing to show for it." I ended the call without another word. The silence that followed was deafening. Useless dirt. My father's insult echoed in the quiet room, but instead of breaking me, it unlocked a door I had kept tightly sealed for years. My mind drifted back 12 years to a dusty front porch on the edge of the Bighorn Basin. I was 14, sitting beside my grandfather on a creaking wooden swing. The air smelled of dry sagebrush and impending rain. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn canvas jacket and handed me a folded manila envelope. The paper was rough against my fingertips. Inside was a property deed to a barren stretch of high plains land. My parents had spent hours mocking that parcel, calling it a worthless tax burden, an eyesore of scrubweed and cracked earth. They begged him to sell it. But my grandfather had looked at me with eyes the color of Wyoming slate. He pointed a calloused finger out toward the horizon where the land met the sky. "The real value in Wyoming, Carrie, is always beneath the surface. People like your father only look at what they can touch right now. You have to learn to look deeper." He transferred that deed into my name right before he passed away. Dennis and Joanne had been furious. They wanted him to sell it and funnel the cash into Kinsley's college fund. Instead, he gave it to the daughter who played in the mud. For over a decade, that piece of paper sat safely tucked in my fireproof lockbox, a quiet inheritance. I never realized how powerful that useless dirt would become. That evening, I did not unpack my graduation dress. I packed my heavy canvas duffel bag instead. I threw in my steel-toed boots, my thermal layers, and my geological surveying equipment. My phone continued to vibrate on the nightstand, lighting up the dark room with a barrage of texts from my mother, my aunt, and even Kinsley herself. They called me bitter. They called me jealous. They demanded I call them back to apologize and fulfill my family duties. I turned the device off and tossed it into the passenger seat of my truck. I drove west out of Casper just as the sun dipped below the jagged silhouette of the Rocky Mountains. The highway stretched out like a dark ribbon cutting through the vast, silent basins. I headed toward the Grand Tetons for a new long-term field assignment. As the city lights faded in my rearview mirror, the suffocating pressure of my family's artificial, fragile facade fell away. The mountains were brutal and honest. They did not pretend to be anything else. They weathered storms and stood unbothered by the noise of the world. I decided to do the same. I cut contact entirely. For 3 months, I existed in a state of beautiful, productive isolation. I threw myself into my work, surveying mineral deposits by day and running complex topographical data by night. I blocked their phone numbers. I stopped checking social media accounts. I stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come. I built a quiet routine of early mornings, strong black coffee, and the satisfying crunch of gravel under my boots. The pain of the empty chairs at graduation began to fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of a life I was constructing with my own 2 hands. I spent my days navigating the sprawling extraction sites surrounded by heavy machinery and people who valued hard facts over emotional manipulation. The dust and the engine noise became my sanctuary. I was earning my place, proving my worth through sheer endurance and sharp intellect. I thought the silence meant I had won. I assumed that by removing myself from their orbit, they would simply forget about me and focus all their attention on the golden child and her perfect impending family. I figured they had washed their hands of the daughter who refused to buy the stroller. I found a sense of peace I had never known. Every evening I would sit on the porch of my rented cabin, watching the alpenglow turn the peaks vibrant shades of pink and orange. I felt untouchable. The high plains had a way of making you feel small, but in a comforting way. My family drama seemed insignificant compared to the geological forces that had shaped this landscape over millions of years. I belonged out here among the rocks and the wide-open sky, far away from the stifling expectations of Aunt Rhonda's dining room. But I drastically underestimated their greed. I forgot that financial predators do not care if you walk away. They do not care about your boundaries or your newly found peace. They only care if you still have something they desperately want to consume. And as I would soon discover, the quiet was not a surrender. It was just the calm before the ambush. During those 90 days of radio silence, I constructed an impenetrable fortress out of my career. Working as the lead geological surveyor for a sprawling mineral extraction corporation, I navigated the unforgiving terrain of Wyoming's booming industrial sector. My days began long before dawn, the crisp, high-altitude air biting at my cheeks as I stepped onto sites dominated by colossal drilling rigs and roaring earth movers. The scent of diesel exhaust, pulverized limestone, and raw ozone became my daily perfume. I earned a lucrative six-figure salary, commanding respect from crews of hardened rig workers who quickly learned I tolerated zero errors and accepted no excuses. I wore steel-toed boots, a high-visibility jacket, and a hard hat, operating in a reality governed by hard data, sediment density, and structural integrity. It was a universe away from Kinsley's pampered existence of monogrammed diaper bags, country club brunches, and artificial milestones. Out here on the high plains, status was earned through competence, not credit cards. I cemented an indestructible foundation for my future, relying solely on my own intellect, grit, and endurance. I was no longer the neglected shadow of my family tree. I was a rising authority in a billion-dollar industry. The men who initially doubted my presence on the rigs now deferred to my safety assessments and drilling coordinates. I was proving that my degree was far from useless. It was the key to unlocking the Earth's most guarded vaults. My value to the corporation surged exponentially when executives granted me clearance to utilize their most guarded technological asset. I devoted every spare hour to mastering a highly restricted, cutting-edge three-dimensional topographical mapping software. This program transcended standard industry equipment. It utilized satellite telemetry, seismic echo plotting, and deep-penetrating sonar frequencies to render subterranean heat maps. The system was specifically engineered to locate hidden geothermal pockets and unmined rare earth mineral deposits. I spent countless evenings bathed in the cool blue glow of dual monitors, rotating holographic models of the Earth's crust with subtle movements of my mouse. I learned how to read the vibrant bleeds of crimson, gold, and violet on the screen, recognizing them as indicators of trapped energy and untold wealth resting silently beneath the topsoil. Decoding those hidden geographical layers provided a profound sense of control. I was uncovering ancient secrets the Earth had buried for millennia, predicting land value with terrifying accuracy. The software allowed me to strip away the barren surface of the Wyoming plains and peer directly into the fiery, churning heart of the planet below. I possessed no inkling that mastering this specific analytical tool would soon become the exact weapon I required to dismantle a fraudulent empire. Autumn arrived early, painting the surrounding scrub brush in brittle shades of copper and frost. I sat at the head of a long mahogany table, leading a high-stakes strategy meeting in the glass-walled conference room of our regional field office. We were analyzing core samples for a multi-million-dollar expansion project near the Wind River Basin. The room hummed with the low, serious murmurs of senior executives poring over my geological charts. Suddenly, the flashing red light of the internal intercom caught my eye. My assistant's voice crackled through the speaker, her tone laced with unprecedented confusion. She announced that I had uninvited guests in the main reception area, claiming a dire family emergency. She added that they refused to leave the premises until they spoke with me directly. A cold prickle of dread washed down my spine, but I kept my face an unreadable professional mask. I excused myself from the board of directors, smoothing the lapels of my tailored blazer. My heavy boots echoed against the polished concrete floor of the corridor as I marched toward the front doors, my mind racing through a dozen disastrous scenarios. My parents never traveled this far north. They despised the dust and the roughneck culture of the extraction towns, preferring the manicured lawns and gated communities of their suburban bubble. Their presence here was an anomaly in my carefully structured data set. I rounded the final corner and stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting on the sleek leather couches of our industrial lobby, looking utterly ridiculous amidst the steel architectural beams and safety protocol posters, were Joanne and Dennis. They had somehow bypassed the outer gate security guard, likely weaponizing their middle-class suburban entitlement to bully a young contractor. My mother wore a pristine beige trench coat, her knuckles white as she clutched a designer handbag like a life preserver in a stormy sea. My father paced the floor in his pressed khakis, checking his gold wristwatch every few seconds. The quiet, professional sanctuary I had painstakingly built was instantly contaminated by their nervous energy. When Joanne spotted me standing near the reception desk, she launched into a theatrical performance worthy of a daytime television broadcast. She rushed forward, entirely skipping a standard greeting, and grabbed my forearms. Her eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with smudged mascara, and fresh tears spilled continuously down her cheeks. She wore a pathetic, faux-apologetic smile that contorted her features into a mask of pure desperation. It was a stark contrast to the smug superiority they usually projected. The sight of them, trembling and out of place among the mud-caked drillers crossing the lobby, sent a bizarre wave of satisfaction mixed with intense caution through my veins. "Carrie, thank God you are here," she sobbed, her voice trembling loudly enough to ensure the receptionist heard every single syllable. "We did not know where else to turn. We are losing the house. We are losing everything we have ever worked for." I stiffened, pulling my arms out of her frantic, clawing grip. Dennis stepped up beside her, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder, adopting the posture of a beaten, exhausted patriarch. He looked me in the eye, completely stripping away the arrogant sneer he had worn the last time we spoke on the phone. He claimed they were drowning in crippling hospital bills, crushed under the immense weight of a sudden medical crisis they could no longer manage or hide. They begged me to spare just 1 hour of my afternoon. They pleaded for me to join them at a nearby highway diner to discuss what they termed a catastrophic family emergency. Every instinct honed over 26 years screamed at me to signal security and have them escorted off the property. These were the people who abandoned me at my graduation. These were the people who mocked my profession. These were the people who demanded I finance their golden niece's luxury lifestyle while ignoring my achievements. Yet standing there under the harsh fluorescent lights of the corporate lobby, the analytical side of my brain whirred to life. I studied their trembling hands, their darting nervous glances, and the genuine sweat beating on my father's forehead. This specific level of sheer panic was not a fabricated emotion. Something real had terrified them to their core. I needed to know exactly what kind of financial ruin could force them to drive 3 hours across the desolate Wyoming landscape to seek salvation from the daughter they considered entirely worthless. I nodded once, grabbed my wool coat from the rack, and followed them out the glass doors, stepping right into the opening jaws of their trap. The freezing wind whipped across the parking lot as we walked toward their pristine SUV. I did not speak a word, letting the silence stretch and tighten around us like a snare. Whatever game they were playing, I was no longer the naive pawn they remembered. I was the house, and I was about to count cards. The Black Gold Diner sat on the edge of the interstate. It was a relic of the mid-century oil boom, smelling permanently of scorched coffee and fried potatoes. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth across from Joanne and Dennis. The neon sign buzzed outside, casting a flickering red glow across their pale faces. My father kept drumming his fingers against the sticky Formica tabletop. My mother twisted a paper napkin into tight little knots. I ordered black tea and waited. I was an expert at reading geological pressure building beneath the crust. Right now, the pressure sitting across from me was palpable. Joanne leaned forward, her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. She launched into a tragic narrative detailing a sudden string of uncovered medical expenses. She claimed Dennis had suffered severe cardiac issues requiring out-of-network specialists and experimental treatments. According to her, the bills had drained their savings and maxed out their credit lines. The performance was Oscar-worthy, complete with quivering lips and dabbed tears. Dennis interjected to play the proud patriarch, brought low by unfortunate circumstances. He stared at his calloused hands, declaring that they were on the verge of foreclosure. They needed a lifeline. Specifically, they needed a co-signer for a mortgage refinancing to consolidate the debt and save their home. "How much?" I asked. My tone was flat, betraying zero emotion. Dennis cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze. $400,000. The number hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Growing up in Casper, my parents governed our household finances with ruthless precision. They tracked every penny to maintain their pristine suburban image. They prioritized country club dues over my winter coats, but they never missed a mortgage payment. They possessed sterling credit scores and a deep fear of public embarrassment. Medical debt of that magnitude would require months of hospitalization. Yet here was my father, looking perfectly tanned and healthy, drumming his fingers with relentless energy. "You always said family helps family," Joanne pleaded. Her eyes darted around the diner, ensuring her performance registered with the few patrons sitting nearby. "We would never ask if it was not a matter of life and death." I took a slow sip of my tea. The bitter liquid washed down the irony coating my throat. Family helps family. The phrase was a weapon they wielded whenever they needed compliance. It was the same family that ignored my college graduation to attend a party celebrating Kinsley having a baby. They skipped the most important day of my life because my academic achievements did not fit their narrative of success. Now they sat in a greasy highway diner, demanding I leverage my hard-earned corporate salary to bail them out. My training kicked in. When you survey land for drilling, you do not just look at the surface topography. You examine the core samples. You search for fault lines and structural inconsistencies. I applied the exact same analytical rigor to their story. If you are refinancing a residential property to cover hospital bills, I need to see the itemized medical debt, I said. My voice remained calm and measured. I also need to review the loan origination forms from the bank. Give me the physical paperwork. I will read it over tonight. The request was basic, a standard procedure for anyone preparing to sign a financial contract spanning 3 decades. But to my parents, a request for verification was an act of treason. The mask slipped. Dennis slammed his fist onto the table. The coffee cups rattled. Several diners turned to stare. "How dare you question us?" he hissed. His face flushed a deep mottled purple. The fragile, beaten patriarch vanished, replaced instantly by the arrogant tyrant I knew so well. "We are your parents. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. And this is how you repay us? You demand proof like we are common criminals?" He pointed a shaking finger at my tailored blazer. "You get a little taste of corporate wealth, and suddenly you think you are superior to your own blood. You are a selfish, ungrateful daughter. Your new job has corrupted whatever decent morals you had left." Joanne took her cue perfectly. She escalated the scene, transitioning from quiet desperation to public hysteria. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob loudly. She wailed about raising a heartless child, trying to shame me into submission. She wanted the waitress to judge me. She wanted the trucker in the next booth to view me as a monster. It was a classic manipulation tactic, designed to fluster the target and force a hasty compliance just to make the public spectacle end. But I did not flinch. The cold resolve that had settled in my chest 6 months ago shielded me from their theatrics. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a $10 bill, and placed it neatly on the table to cover my tea. "Email me the documents," I said. My voice sliced through Joanne's fake sobbing like a scalpel. "I will not sign anything blindly. Send the PDFs to my work address." I stood up and walked away. I did not look back. I pushed open the diner doors and stepped out into the freezing High Plains wind. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, but my mind remained incredibly sharp. The entire encounter felt staged. The red herring was expertly planted. They wanted me to focus on the emotional weight of a medical crisis and the fear of losing the childhood home. They wanted me so overwhelmed by guilt and public shame that I would just sign the dotted line to make the discomfort disappear. I drove back to my rented cabin in silence. The tires hummed against the dark asphalt. The vast Wyoming sky stretched above me, filled with cold, distant stars. As soon as I walked through my front door, I bypassed the kitchen and went straight to my home office. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. I flipped open my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room, casting a pale blue light across my desk. I poured myself a glass of ice water and sat down. The numbers simply did not add up. A $400,000 gap does not appear overnight without leaving a vast paper trail. Furthermore, banks do not typically require a highly compensated corporate cosigner unless the primary applicants possess a disastrous debt-to-income ratio. My parents were hiding something substantial. During my time working for the extraction firm, I had gained access to specialized skip tracing software. The corporation used these databases to conduct deep background checks on rival landowners and verify the financial stability of potential contractors. These tools pulled data from public records, county property registries, civil court filings, and lien notifications. They revealed the truth hidden beneath layers of corporate shielding and private banking. I logged into the secure portal. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I entered Dennis and Joanne's full legal names, their social security numbers, and the address of the home they claimed was facing foreclosure. I hit enter. A loading bar crawled across the screen, gathering data from dozens of local and federal databases. I watched the progress indicator inch closer to 100%. The diner confrontation had been a diversion. They needed a signature, and they were willing to orchestrate a theatrical breakdown to get it. I braced myself for whatever financial disaster was about to populate on my monitor. The screen flashed green. A dense list of property records, court judgments, and credit inquiries cascaded down the page. I scrolled through the initial summary. There were 0 medical collections. Not a single hospital lien or unpaid physician invoice existed in their names. The sob story was a complete fabrication. But as I read further down the list, my blood ran cold. The truth waiting in the digital ledger was far more insidious than a simple medical crisis, and it was about to drag me into a terrifying web of deceit. The sun had barely breached the horizon the following morning, casting long, icy shadows across the frost-covered scrub brush outside my window. I stood in the kitchen, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, letting the bitter warmth wake my senses. The quiet solitude of my cabin shattered when my cell phone chimed a sharp, piercing tone. I glanced at the screen, expecting an early dispatch from the extraction site foreman. Instead, a notification banner from my financial security service glowed brightly against the dim light. Urgent credit monitoring alert. I set the mug down on the counter. The ceramic clinked against the granite, a hollow sound in the empty room. My fingers traced the cold glass of the screen as I unlocked the device and opened the encrypted email. My heart performed a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. A commercial lending institution had just initiated a hard inquiry on my credit file. The notification detailed a formal pre-approval application for a substantial commercial loan. The paperwork utilized my social security number, an old billing address from my college years, and a digital signature I never authorized. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Joanne and Dennis did not wait for my consent. They did not wait for me to review the documents they promised to send. Driven by their frantic timeline, they bypassed my autonomy entirely and forged my digital signature. They crossed the line from toxic parenting into the realm of federal wire fraud and identity theft. The sheer audacity required to steal your own daughter's identity while she slept was staggering. A lesser person might have called them immediately screaming into the receiver demanding an explanation. I did not. Screaming provides the enemy with information. It lets them know you are aware, giving them precious time to cover their tracks or concoct a new lie. I needed to trap them in their own deceit. I picked up the phone and dialed the bank's fraud prevention department. The representative on the other end sounded professional and detached, a sharp contrast to the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I instructed her to place a permanent security freeze on my profile across all 3 major reporting bureaus. I flagged the recent commercial inquiry as fraudulent, but requested the bank keep the application file open for internal review, rather than tipping off the applicants. I wanted the trap to remain primed. I needed undeniable, ironclad proof. Navigating corporate extraction law had taught me the value of specialized legal counsel. I took a personal day from the surveying site and drove into town to secure the services of Elias Keller, a seasoned Wyoming property and financial attorney. His reputation was formidable, built on decades of dismantling complex real estate disputes and corporate shielding tactics. Keller's office sat on the top floor of a restored brick building in downtown Casper. The space smelled of lemon polish and aged parchment. A large picture window framed the sweeping, snow-covered plains, offering a stark view of the unforgiving landscape. Keller sat behind a heavy oak desk, his demeanor pragmatic and razor-sharp. He wore a tailored tweed suit and scrutinized the printouts of my credit alert with keen, calculating eyes. "We need to pull the exact application they submitted," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "If they forged your signature on a federal lending document, we have them dead to rights. But we must understand the collateral they are attempting to leverage." Using his legal credentials and the application reference number, Keller initiated a secure retrieval of the pending loan file. The printer in the corner of his office whirred to life, spitting out dozens of pages of dense financial disclosures. We spread the documents across the expansive surface of his desk. The true nature of my parents' desperate diner performance began to unravel before my eyes. The first truth emerged swiftly. The medical debt was a phantom. We combed through the liability schedules and found 0 hospital invoices, 0 out-of-network specialist fees, and 0 pharmaceutical balances. The tragic story Joanne wept over was a calculated fiction engineered to exploit my empathy. Instead, the liability columns revealed a staggering mountain of commercial debt. The ledgers were tied directly to a string of luxury outfitting businesses operating under a corporate umbrella. I traced the registered ownership of the parent company and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The enterprise belonged exclusively to Wyatt. Wyatt was Kinsley's husband. He was the golden son-in-law, the man my parents constantly praised for his supposed entrepreneurial genius. He ran a company offering guided elk hunts and luxury glamping experiences for wealthy out-of-state tourists. It was designed to project an image of rugged affluence, a perfect accessory to Kinsley's designer lifestyle. My parents paraded him around country club dinners, boasting about his visionary business acumen. The paperwork painted a remarkably different reality. Wyatt's visionary business was hemorrhaging cash. The guided hunts were failing, the equipment was heavily financed, and the luxury leases were in default. To keep Kinsley's pristine high society facade intact, Joanne and Dennis had stepped in to float the sinking ship. Keller pointed his pen at a series of property encumbrances. Your parents did not just loan him money, Carrie. They secretly took out multiple secondary and tertiary liens against their own primary residence to inject capital into his failing ventures. They tethered their home to his sinking business. The pieces clicked into place, forming a horrifying picture. The bank was finally calling in the debts. Wyatt was hurtling toward an inevitable commercial bankruptcy. If his corporate entity collapsed, the creditors would seize my parents' house to satisfy the outstanding liens. Joanne and Dennis were not looking for a simple cosigner to help them weather a temporary storm. They were attempting to seamlessly attach my pristine credit score and high corporate income to Wyatt's toxic financial wasteland. They engineered a scheme to make me the legal bag holder. If the forged application went through, I would become financially responsible for a luxury outfitting business I had 0 part in creating. When Wyatt eventually filed for bankruptcy, my wages would be garnished, my savings decimated, and my future ruined, all to ensure Kinsley never had to downgrade her luxury lifestyle. They were willing to sacrifice my entire existence to maintain the illusion of their niece's perfect marriage. The betrayal ran so deep it felt surreal. I stared out the window at the icy Wyoming plains, processing the fact that my own blood relatives viewed me merely as an exploitable resource, a disposable shield to protect their favorite family members. I thought we had hit the bottom of their depravity. I thought the forgery and the hidden debt were the climax of their deceit. But Elias Keller was a man who left no stone unturned. He sat silently, reading through the deeper layers of the business operating agreements and the attached financial disclosures. His brow furrowed, forming deep creases above his wire-rimmed glasses. He began cross-referencing the outgoing wire transfers from Wyatt's corporate accounts with the incoming deposits listed on my parents' personal tax returns. The room grew impossibly quiet. The only sound was the steady ticking of an antique clock on the wall and the crisp rustle of paper as Keller flipped back and forth between 2 distinct ledgers. He paused, tapping his index finger against a specific routing number. He looked up at me, his pragmatic expression shifting into something resembling genuine shock. "Carrie," he murmured, sliding the documents across the polished oak toward me, "you need to look closely at these transaction dates. The money your parents borrowed against their house did not all go toward funding the outfitting business." I leaned forward, scanning the highlighted lines of code and currency. A dark, chilling realization began to form as I traced the flow of capital. The red herring of the medical bills had hidden the commercial debt, but the commercial debt was hiding a crime far more sinister than simple financial incompetence. Wyatt was not just a terrible businessman, and my parents were not just desperate enablers. We were staring at a financial conspiracy that was about to blow the entire family hierarchy into a million jagged pieces. I stared at the highlighted rows of bank routing numbers Elias Keller had arranged across his polished oak desk. The ink seemed to blur for a fraction of a second before my scientific training took over. When analyzing core samples in the field, anomalies in the strata always tell a story of immense pressure and unseen fractures. The financial strata laid out in front of me told a terrifying story of systematic theft. Wyatt was not merely a terrible businessman drowning in overhead costs and failed luxury outfitting leases. He was a predator. The forensic ledgers Keller had subpoenaed painted a damning picture of deliberate extraction. Over the past 4 years, Wyatt had established multiple Dremedy accounts linked to his corporate umbrella. These phantom vendors billed my parents directly for consulting fees, marketing services, and equipment rentals that never actually existed. The funds settling those fake invoices were not coming from Joanne and Dennis' checking accounts. The money was being systematically siphoned directly from their retirement portfolios. Month after month, year after year, Wyatt had drained their life savings. The realization hit me with the blunt force of a rock slide. My parents were not victims of circumstance fighting bravely against a sudden tide of medical debt. They knew exactly what was happening. The dates on their secondary home mortgages coincided perfectly with the moments their retirement accounts were depleted to zero. Instead of turning Wyatt over to the authorities, instead of filing a police report for grand larceny, my parents chose a different path. They chose to become complicit in federal fraud. The question of why twisted like a rusty knife in my gut. The answer was simple and sickening. Kinsley. Kinsley was the golden child, the flawless niece who married the visionary entrepreneur. Shattering that carefully constructed illusion was a fate worse than death for Joanne and Dennis. They spent every weekend attending country club galas, boasting to their wealthy suburban friends about Wyatt and his brilliant business ventures. Admitting their beloved son-in-law was a con artist would invite the social ruin they feared more than poverty. To preserve the pastel-colored fantasy of Kinsley's flawless high society marriage, they were actively covering for the man who robbed them blind. And I was the sacrificial lamb. My parents were perfectly willing to serve my financial future on a silver platter to a criminal just to ensure Kinsley never had to experience a single moment of discomfort or public humiliation. They had evaluated my worth, my pristine credit score, my rising corporate salary, and deemed it all expendable. The sickness of that dynamic washed over me, leaving a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. They were protecting their abuser by feeding him their own daughter. My phone vibrated against the leather armrest of my chair, breaking the heavy silence in the office. The screen illuminated the dim room, displaying a new text message from Joanne. I picked up the device. The message read like a script from a daytime drama. "Carrie, honey, your father is so stressed, his chest is hurting again. We really need you to step up and do the right thing for the family. Please call us back." It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Do the right thing for the family. The sheer audacity of those words radiated from the glowing screen. She was sending sweet, guilt-laden messages while actively participating in a scheme to forge my signature on commercial debt instruments. She wanted me to feel directly responsible for my father's fabricated heart condition, hoping my empathy would blind me to the slaughterhouse they were leading me into. I set the phone face down on the desk. I did not type a reply. I did not block her number. I needed them to believe I was still agonizing over the decision, still playing the role of the obedient, desperate daughter, seeking their elusive approval. "They are protecting him," I whispered, my voice sounding hollow in the expansive office. Keller nodded, his expression grave and unyielding. It is a classic case of sunk cost fallacy combined with extreme social preservation. They are too deep into the lie to claw their way out, so they decided to pull you down into the pit to cushion their fall. This was no longer just about paying off debt. This was a calculated, multi-layered financial ambush. The anger that ignited in my chest was not hot or erratic. It burned with a cold, steady intensity, much like the geothermal vents I tracked beneath the Wyoming crust. I looked at the attorney, feeling a profound shift in my own identity. I was done being the neglected child. "Mr. Keller," I said, keeping my tone eerily calm, "if they just wanted to use my income to qualify for a loan to satisfy Wyatt creditors, why forge a commercial application? A standard residential cosigner agreement would have provided the cash they needed." Keller adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. A spark of genuine respect flashed in his eyes. "That is the exact question that bothered me, Carrie, which brings us to the actual structure of this specific loan." He reached for the dense 100-page application my parents had submitted to the bank. He bypassed the standard liability schedules, the forged income verification forms, and the fake medical hardship letters they had drafted. He flipped past the signature lines and the notary blocks, his fingers navigating the labyrinth of legal jargon, until he stopped near the very end of the packet. "Banks bury the most dangerous clauses deep in the boilerplate," Keller explained, tracing his expensive pen down a page densely packed with microscopic font. "Page 74, Section 9, subsection C. Read this." I leaned over the desk, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. The paragraph was intentionally obscured by convoluted corporate phrasing, a maze of cross-collateralization terms designed to confuse any layman who dared to read it. But I was not a layman. I spent my days deciphering complex extraction leases and land rights agreements for a billion-dollar corporation. As the meaning of the words crystallized in my mind, the air in the room seemed to evaporate. The forged loan was not merely an instrument to absorb the embezzlement losses. The commercial application required a specific type of tangible collateral to underwrite the immense risk of Wyatt failing business. My parents did not have enough equity left in their home to satisfy the bank demands. They needed an unencumbered asset, something with undeniable value to secure the funding. They had found one, and they had buried the transfer of that asset deep on page 74. The end game was not just making me responsible for the monthly payments. Their ultimate goal was a permanent legal transfer of property. They were attempting to steal the only thing of genuine value I possessed, an asset they had spent over a decade pretending was entirely worthless. The scope of their greed was breathtaking, setting the stage for a confrontation that would alter the trajectory of all our lives. Mr. Keller adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and tapped his silver pen against the dense block of text on page 74. The air in his office felt suddenly thin, drawn out of the room by the sheer gravity of what lay hidden in the ink. I leaned closer, reading the intricate legal phrasing that my parents assumed I would simply gloss over in a rush of emotional compliance. This was not a standard cosigner agreement guaranteeing a monthly payment schedule. Buried deep within the boilerplate was a quitclaim deed, seamlessly paired with a commercial cross-collateralization agreement. The terminology sounded clinical, but the implications were lethal. Keller traced the printed lines outlining the path of the proposed transaction. If I signed this specific stack of papers, I would unknowingly surrender the collateral rights to my grandfather's High Plains Basin land. The transfer bypassed my control entirely, routing the asset directly into a holding company exclusively managed by Wyatt. Joanne and Dennis were not merely trying to save their suburban home from foreclosure. They were orchestrating a staggering heist of my inheritance. They intended to cannibalize my only legacy to fund Kinsley's lavish lifestyle and erase her husband's criminal debts. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, letting the chilling reality wash over me. The scale of the betrayal left me breathless, a sharp ache expanding in my chest before turning to ice. It was one thing to forge a digital inquiry to check my credit bandwidth. It was another universe of depravity to draft a legal instrument designed to strip away my property while looking me in the eye and crying fake tears over fictitious hospital bills. Why could they not just forge this too, I asked. My voice sounded distant, echoing in the quiet room. If they already faked my digital signature on the pre-approval, why invite me to the diner at all? Why not just steal it remotely? Keller shook his head, folding his hands atop the manila folder. Because real estate transfers of this magnitude require a wet signature, the bank mandates a physical ink signature executed in the direct presence of a licensed notary public. They cannot fake a biometric endorsement on a quitclaim deed without risking immediate federal prison time if the notary is audited. They need you in a room, Carrie. They need you holding the pen. The mechanics of their scheme clicked into place with horrifying precision. The diner ambushed the weeping, the sudden urgency. It was all a calculated performance to herd me into a confined space with a notary. They wanted me flustered, overwhelmed by guilt, and desperate to alleviate my mother's sobbing. They banked on the assumption that a dutiful daughter would never demand to read all 100 pages of a medical debt consolidation loan. They expected me to skip to the back page and sign my life away just to earn a fleeting moment of their approval. My grief evaporated. The lingering sorrow of being an unloved child burned away in a fraction of a second, replaced by a frigid, calculated vengeance. I looked down at the geographical coordinates printed on the fraudulent deed. Section 4 Township, 40 North, Range 90 West. My mind drifted back to the harsh, sweeping landscape of the Bighorn Basin. I pictured the cracked earth, the resilient sagebrush, the unrelenting wind that scoured the plains. Dennis and Joanne always viewed that acreage as a barren wasteland. They called it useless dirt. When my grandfather passed away, they were enraged that he bequeathed the parcel to me instead of liquidating it to pad Kinsley's college fund. They mocked the inheritance for years, viewing it as a stubborn old man's final insult to their refined suburban sensibilities. They were willing to steal it now only because they believed the acreage held just enough baseline agricultural equity to satisfy Wyatt's ravenous creditors. They thought they were cleverly discarding a worthless piece of scrubland to save their precious illusion of high society perfection. But they were operating on outdated information. They did not possess my education. They did not have access to the proprietary geological data I analyzed every single day. I knew something they did not. "Mr. Keller," I said, leveling my gaze at the attorney. The tone of my voice made him sit up straighter, abandoning his relaxed posture. "I need you to draft a new set of documents immediately." "What kind of documents?" he asked, picking up a fresh legal pad. "An irrevocable corporate trust," I replied. "I want to transfer the deed and all associated subterranean mineral rights of the basin land into a shielded entity. I will be the sole executor and the primary beneficiary. I want the trust structured so tightly that no outside party, no creditor, and certainly no relative can ever place a lien against it or compel a transfer of ownership." Keller raised an eyebrow, his pen hovering over the yellow paper. "Creating an irrevocable trust is a permanent maneuver, Carrie. Once the asset is inside, you cannot easily undo the structure. It shields the property from external liability, but it also locks your own flexibility. Are you certain the underlying value of this specific parcel justifies the exorbitant legal setup fees required to build such a fortress?" I looked out the large picture window at the sprawling Wyoming landscape. The snow-capped peaks gleamed in the afternoon sun, hiding untold power beneath their frozen exterior. The wind whipped powder off the ridges, a visual reminder of the raw energy waiting to be harnessed. "The coordinates listed on this fraudulent deed do not just represent dirt," I explained, keeping my voice steady and low. "My parents think they are stealing a barren pasture to pay off a few luxury hunting leases, but they do not know what lies beneath the topsoil." I turned back to Keller. "I am a geological surveyor, Mr. Keller. I spend my life mapping the hidden architecture of this state. I am going to secure my assets permanently. I need you to draft the preliminary paperwork tonight, because once they realize I am stalling, they are going to escalate their tactics. We need the armor ready to deploy before they strike again." Keller smiled a sharp, predatory grin that told me I had chosen the right legal counsel. He understood the stakes of the game we were playing. He began writing furiously, outlining the framework of the trust on his legal pad. We spent the next hour detailing the exact parameters of the corporate shield, discussing bylaws, ironclad succession clauses, and anti-coercion provisions. We were drafting the blueprints for a legal vault that Joanne and Dennis could never breach. As I watched his pen glide across the paper, a profound sense of empowerment settled over me. For 26 years, I had been the passive recipient of my family's neglect. I absorbed their insults, their favoritism, their endless demands for compliance. I allowed them to define my worth based on how useful I could be to Kinsley's narrative. I shrank myself to fit into the tiny restrictive boxes they assigned me. That era ended in this office. I was no longer the discarded daughter crying in an empty graduation auditorium. I was an architect preparing to engineer their inevitable downfall. By the time the winter sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the office floor, the preliminary strategy was set. Keller handed me a secure folder containing the draft requirements. I needed to verify the exact scope of the asset before we finalized the transfer. The trap my parents built for me was slowly reversing its hinges, preparing to snap shut on their own fingers. I shook the attorney's hand and walked out into the biting evening air. The cold wind felt invigorating, rushing deep into my lungs and clearing away the last remnants of my familial guilt. I drove my truck through the darkening streets of downtown Casper with a clear mind and a steady pulse. I knew Joanne and Dennis were sitting in their pristine living room watching the clock tick down on Wyatt's impending bankruptcy. They were waiting for me to call waiting. For me to surrender, waiting for the obedient girl to return and save them from the consequences of their own actions. They needed my physical signature. They needed me in a room. And since I was refusing to play the compliant victim, I knew they were running out of time. My phone buzzed, sliding an inch across the passenger seat. I did not look at the glowing screen. I did not care what fresh manipulation Joanne had typed out. My focus was locked on the horizon. Tomorrow morning, I would head straight to the extraction firm headquarters. It was time to boot up the classified topographical software and take a hard digital look at exactly what my grandfather had left me. It was time to pull the raw, undeniable data from beneath the soil and arm the final mechanism of my defense. The pre-dawn sky over Casper hung in a deep shade of bruised indigo as I pulled my truck into the empty parking lot of the extraction firm headquarters. The biting morning air stung my lungs, carrying the faint scent of diesel and pine. I swiped my keycard at the secure entrance. The heavy glass doors slid open with a quiet mechanical hum. The lobby was deserted, allowing my boots to echo sharply against the polished concrete floor. I did not bother turning on the main overhead lights. I navigated the familiar corridors by the pale emergency exit glow, heading straight for the subterranean data wing. This section of the building housed our most guarded technological assets. I entered my private laboratory and locked the reinforced door behind me. The room smelled of ozone and cold, filtered air. I settled into the ergonomic mesh chair at my workstation and powered up the dual-monitor rig. The cooling fans roared to life, sounding like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. I opened the classified three-dimensional topographical mapping software. It required a 12-character alphanumeric password and a biometric fingerprint scan to launch. The interface materialized on the screens, casting a cool blue light across my face. My pulse maintained a steady, rhythmic thud. I pulled a folded piece of notebook paper from my jacket pocket. On it, I had transcribed the exact geographical coordinates listed in the fraudulent quitclaim deed my parents tried to slip past me. Section 4, Township 40 North, Range 90 West. I typed the string of numbers into the command terminal and hit the execute key. The software connected to our private satellite array and began pulling regional seismic data. A progress bar crawled across the bottom of the left monitor. I leaned back, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched as the program constructed a high-resolution surface image of my grandfather's acreage. From a bird's-eye view, the land looked exactly as my parents had always described it, a barren stretch of cracked earth dotted with resilient sagebrush and weather-beaten limestone ridges. Useless dirt. But I was not interested in the surface. I engaged the subsurface rendering protocols. I directed the software to strip away the topsoil, the quaternary sediments, and the shallow bedrock. The image on the screen morphed, peeling back the earth layer by layer. I switched the visual filters to read thermal output and mineral density. The right monitor suddenly erupted in a brilliant spectrum of color. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the desk. Deep beneath the gray and brown strata, vibrant plumes of crimson and violet bloomed across the digital map. The thermal imaging indicated a high-yield geothermal gradient trapped beneath a layer of impermeable shale. It was a staggering reservoir of clean, untapped energy waiting to be harnessed. But the geothermal pockets were only half the story. I isolated the density scanners targeting the anomalous violet clusters hugging the fault lines. The elemental breakdown populated in a sidebar. The raw data confirmed the presence of dense, rare earth mineral veins. Neodymium, dysprosium, praseodymium. These were the crucial elements required to manufacture advanced electronics, electric vehicle batteries, and military-grade technology. Finding a concentrated deposit of this caliber on private, unencumbered land was the geological equivalent of discovering a winning lottery ticket. The valuation calculation formulated in my mind long before the software finished its automated appraisal. We were not talking about a few $100,000 in grazing rights. The extraction potential sitting beneath that barren scrubland was worth tens of millions of dollars. 8 figures, minimum. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing monitors. The harsh blue light reflected in my eyes. My grandfather's raspy voice echoed through my memory, ringing clearer than it had in a decade. The real value in Wyoming Carry is always beneath the surface. He knew. He might not have possessed the satellite telemetry or the thermal imaging software, but the old man had spent his entire life working this land. He understood the unique geological markers, the strange heat radiating from the spring water, the unusual weight of the rocks he kicked boots against. He knew the earth held a secret, and he chose to leave that secret to the only person in the family who did not care about surface appearances. He entrusted it to the girl who liked to play in the mud. The puzzle pieces regarding my parents' sudden desperation finally locked into a flawless, terrifying picture. Wyatt was a failing outfitter drowning in commercial debt, but he operated within circles of wealthy land developers and prospectors. He must have caught wind of a preliminary survey. Perhaps an independent energy scout had mailed an inquiry to my parents' house, attempting to purchase the mineral rights for pennies on the dollar. Joanne and Dennis saw the inquiry and realized the useless dirt they had mocked for years was actually a gold mine. They saw their salvation. They saw a way to erase Wyatt's embezzlement debts, secure Kinsley's luxurious future, and maintain their pristine high society facade. The only obstacle standing in their way was me. They needed my wet signature to transfer the deed before I ever realized what I actually owned. A cold, tight smile formed on my lips. They were too late. I minimized the topographical mapping software and opened my secure encrypted email client. Elias Keller had delivered the finalized, irrevocable trust documents late last night. The legal framework was a masterpiece of corporate shielding. The entity was named Basin Apex Holdings. I was listed as the sole executor and the exclusive beneficiary. The bylaws contained ironclad anti-coercion provisions, meaning no outside creditor could ever pierce the corporate veil or force a liquidation of the assets. I downloaded the PDF files and opened my digital notary portal. Because I was simply funding my own newly created corporate entity with an asset I already owned outright, I did not need to sit in a room with a hostile audience. I uploaded my verified state identification, confirmed my biometric markers, and applied my registered digital signature to the transfer deeds. I navigated to the Wyoming Secretary of State online registry. I paid the expedited filing fees using my corporate credit card and submitted the signed trust documents directly to the county clerk database. A loading wheel spun for 3 agonizing seconds before the screen refreshed, displaying a bright green confirmation checkmark. The transaction was complete. The timestamp read 6:14 in the morning. My grandfather's legacy was officially locked inside an impenetrable legal vault. The deed no longer belonged to Carrie Carter, the vulnerable daughter. It belonged to Basin Apex Holdings, a shielded fortress that Joanne and Dennis could never breach. The trap was now fully armed and operational. A dark, poetic irony settled over the quiet laboratory. My parents were currently sitting in their manicured suburban kitchen, aggressively plotting a multi-layered federal fraud scheme to steal an asset that was already gone. They were hunting a ghost. They were conspiring to empty a safe that I had just relocated to a different dimension. I printed the confirmation receipts and slipped them into a thick manila folder. I shut down the dual monitors, plunging the room back into shadows. The humming of the cooling fan spun down into silence. I walked out of the laboratory and headed toward the break room to brew a fresh pot of coffee. The morning shift workers would be arriving soon, filling the corridors with the sounds of ringing phones and heavy footsteps. My mind shifted to the next phase of the game. Joanne and Dennis were running out of time. Wyatt's creditors were circling closer every single day. My parents needed me in a room with a pen, and they needed it immediately. Since I had walked out of the diner and ignored their manipulative text messages, they were bound to realize that playing the victim was not working. Bullies do not retreat when their initial tactics fail. They escalate. If they could not shame me into compliance with fake tears and fabricated heart conditions, they would try to force my hand by attacking the only thing I valued. They would target my livelihood. I poured the dark roast coffee into my travel mug, taking a long, slow sip. I welcomed the bitter caffeine kick. Let them try. I was standing on solid rock now, holding a shield they could not break. All I had to do was wait for their desperation to override their caution. I walked back toward my office, ready to face whatever frantic, destructive move they decided to make next. The next 48 hours passed with deceptive tranquility. I settled back into my standard routine at the extraction firm, reviewing core samples and refining the topographical maps of my newly secured basin land. The digital transfer of the deed into Basin Apex Holdings provided a profound sense of insulation. I operated under the assumption that Joanne and Dennis were currently sitting in their pristine suburban living room, waiting for my eventual capitulation. I expected them to send more guilt-ridden text messages or perhaps leave a weeping voicemail. I anticipated standard emotional manipulation. I underestimated the depths of their desperation. Bullies do not gracefully accept silence. When deprived of their primary weapon, they look for leverage elsewhere. On Thursday afternoon, the flashing amber light of my desk console interrupted a complex thermal density calculation. The caller identification displayed the direct line for Director Mitchell. Mitchell was the regional head of our extraction division, a hardened veteran of the Wyoming energy sector who possessed a terrifying intellect and zero tolerance for corporate drama. He was a man who measured worth in profit margins and geological accuracy, not social pedigree. "Carter," he barked through the speaker the moment I picked up the receiver. "Get up to my office, now." The line went dead. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I locked my workstation and smoothed the wrinkles from my blazer and navigated the labyrinth of cubicles toward the executive suite. The top floor of the facility smelled of expensive leather and polished cedar. I knocked twice on the heavy mahogany door before pushing it open. Director Mitchell sat behind an expansive desk overlooking the sprawling industrial yard. His weathered face was unreadable. He gestured toward a sleek black speakerphone sitting in the center of his blotter. "We record all external calls routed through the executive switchboard," Mitchell stated, his voice flat and calm. "I received a very interesting inquiry 20 minutes ago. I want you to listen to this." He pressed a button. A recorded dial tone buzzed briefly, followed by the unmistakable voice of my father. Dennis utilized his most distinguished patriarchal tone, the exact cadence he employed when negotiating country club dues or attempting to intimidate a service worker. He introduced himself to my boss as a concerned parent dealing with a tragic family crisis. I stood rigid in the center of the office, listening as my father spun a fictitious narrative so twisted it made the air in my lungs turn to ice. Dennis claimed I was experiencing a severe mental breakdown brought on by the stress of my new corporate position. He told Director Mitchell that I had recently engaged in erratic behavior, culminating in a malicious attempt to steal inherited family land. The performance was chillingly methodical. He accused me of elder financial abuse, stating that I was leveraging my high salary and corporate resources to coerce my ailing parents into signing away their property rights. "We are exploring our legal options," Dennis lied smoothly through the recorded line, "but given her current instability, we believe it is in the best interest of your firm to immediately suspend her employment and freeze her corporate assets pending a formal human resources investigation. She is a liability to your reputation, sir. We just want to get our daughter the psychological help she needs before she damages your company." The recording ended with a soft click. The silence in the executive suite felt heavy and charged. I stared at the black speakerphone, processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Dennis was attempting to orchestrate my professional ruin. He understood that my career was the only thing I had ever built for myself. It was the source of my independence, the shield that allowed me to walk away from his dinner table. By planting a fabricated story of elder abuse and title disputes, he hoped to trigger a mandatory corporate suspension. He calculated that stripping away my income and my professional credibility would leave me destitute, panicked, and desperate enough to sign his fraudulent commercial loan just to make the nightmare stop. It was extortion in its purest form. I looked up at Director Mitchell, bracing myself for an interrogation. Instead, I found him leaning back in his leather chair, a dark, amused smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Your old man missed his calling in theater," Mitchell said, folding his hands across his stomach. I let out a slow, measured breath. "You do not believe him." Mitchell laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the cedar walls. "Carter, you just handed this division a subterranean map outlining a high-yield geothermal reservoir intertwined with rare earth minerals. You generated more projected revenue in the last 3 months than our entire surveying department managed all year. I do not care if your father thinks you are unstable. I care about your data, and your data is flawless." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Furthermore, any idiot can hear the desperation in his voice. Men who possess actual leverage do not call their daughter's employer to beg for a suspension. They call their lawyers. He is out of bullets and he is throwing rocks. The validation from a man who commanded a billion-dollar operation was staggering. For my entire life, my parents dictated my worth. Now their carefully crafted suburban authority held zero weight against the undeniable reality of my professional competence. "I want to be clear," Mitchell continued, his tone shifting from amused to fiercely protective. "If this family title dispute escalates into a genuine legal threat, you inform me immediately. You have the full backing of our corporate legal department. We protect our top assets, Carter. Do not let this suburban noise distract you from the Basin Project." I thanked him and walked out of the executive suite. The psychological shift that occurred during that short walk back to my desk was profound. Any lingering trace of familial obligation, any quiet whisper of guilt for locking away my grandfather's land, evaporated into the sterile office air. My parents had just attempted to destroy my livelihood. Empathy died in that corridor, replaced by a tactical coldness. I left the office precisely at 5 o'clock and drove straight to the downtown legal district. Elias Keller was waiting for me in his conference room. The polished table was covered in stacks of crisp white paper and legal folders. I recounted the phone call with Director Mitchell. Keller simply nodded, his expression grim and unsurprised. When cornered, financial predators always attempt to isolate their targets, he explained, sorting a stack of financial disclosures. "Your father tried to cut your supply line. Since that failed, we must prepare for the final confrontation. They are going to force a physical meeting." We spent the next 4 hours assembling the ultimate countermeasure. I did not want a digital file. I wanted a physical weapon. We constructed a heavy, thick binder bound in black leather with reinforced metal rings. We utilized numbered plastic tabs to organize their destruction. Tab 1 contained the forged commercial loan application, highlighting the fake digital signature and the embedded quitclaim deed. Tab 2 held the staggering forensic accounting records, exposing Wyatt's 4-year embezzlement scheme, proving that my parents were funding a criminal. Tab 3 consisted of printed federal statutes detailing the exact prison sentences for wire fraud and identity theft. The final section contained the executed and time-stamped Basin Apex Holdings trust confirmation, proving the land was permanently out of their reach. The binder weighed nearly 5 pounds. The tactile sensation of snapping the metal rings shut was immensely satisfying. It was a physical manifestation of boundaries. As we packed the documents into my briefcase, Keller checked his secure legal terminal. He pulled up the county docket and turned the screen toward me. "We have a catalyst," he murmured, pointing to a fresh filing. "Wyatt's primary creditors filed a formal notice of default this afternoon. The grace period is over. The banks are initiating the asset seizure process." I stared at the glowing text. The walls were rapidly closing in on Joanne and Dennis. They had maybe 48 hours before the financial collapse of Kinsley's perfect marriage became public record. They needed the forged commercial loan submitted to the underwriters by the end of the week to halt the foreclosure. Since I had ignored their texts and survived their workplace sabotage, they were out of options. "They are going to panic," I said, my voice low and steady. Keller nodded, shutting down his computer. "They will manufacture an emergency, something catastrophic enough that you cannot justify ignoring it, something that requires your immediate physical presence." I carried the heavy black binder out to my truck. The evening air was freezing, biting through my wool coat. I placed the evidence on the passenger seat where my cell phone rested. The screen was dark and silent. I drove back to my cabin, navigating the winding, unlit roads of the high plains. I felt like a hunter sitting quietly in a blind, waiting for the prey to step onto the illuminated snow. The trap was armed, the evidence was secured, the ticking clock of Wyatt's creditors echoed in the back of my mind. It was only a matter of time before my phone rang with the performance of a lifetime, setting the stage for a reckoning they would never forget. The trap finally sprang on a Tuesday morning, just as the pale winter sun breached the horizon. I was sitting at my kitchen island, drinking black coffee and reviewing a fresh batch of thermal imaging reports. The cabin was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the wind rattling the frosted window panes. My phone sat beside my mug, dark and silent for days. Then the screen illuminated. The device vibrated against the granite countertop, emitting a sharp, distinct tone. It was a voicemail notification. The caller identification displayed my cousin Kinsley. I set down my pen and tapped the screen to listen. Kinsley rarely called me directly. Her preferred method of communication involved using Joanne or Aunt Rhonda as intermediaries to relay her demands. Hearing her voice on my direct line signaled a significant shift in their strategy. The audio began with a sharp intake of breath, followed by a ragged theatrical sob. "Carrie, please pick up the phone," Kinsley whimpered, her voice pitching into a high, breathy register. "I am at my mother's house. The doctor just left. I am having a severe stress-induced pregnancy complication. My blood pressure is spiking and they are worried about the baby. I cannot handle this financial nightmare hanging over our heads. Please, you have to come over right now and help us finalize this paperwork. I am begging you to save my child's future." The recording ended with another calculated sob and a soft click. I did not move. I let the silence return to the kitchen, analyzing the performance with the same clinical detachment I used to evaluate sediment density. Growing up, Kinsley was treated like a porcelain artifact. If she scraped a knee on the playground, the entire family treated the incident like a fatal wound, swarming her with bandages and soothing words. Meanwhile, I could fracture a wrist falling off a bicycle, and Dennis would tell me to walk it off and stop seeking attention. Kinsley learned early on that weaponizing her fragility guaranteed immediate compliance from everyone in her orbit. She was deploying that exact weapon now, using her unborn child as a human shield to force my hand. Less than 30 seconds later, a text message arrived from Joanne. The text was not a plea. It was a direct order engineered to inflict maximum emotional damage. "Your cousin is in physical danger because of the stress you are causing this family by delaying the consolidation loan. Get to Aunt Rhonda's estate immediately. The bank sent an official to finalize the documents. Do not be the reason Kinsley loses this baby." I read the words twice, absorbing the sheer toxicity of the threat. They were explicitly blaming me for a fabricated medical emergency, aiming to crush me under the weight of an unbearable guilt. It was a flawless manipulation tactic, designed to bypass logical thought and trigger a frantic emotional response. The old version of Carrie Carter would have crumbled. The girl who sat in that empty graduation auditorium would have grabbed her car keys, trembling with anxiety, and sped across town. She would have burst through the front doors, weeping apologies, desperate to fix whatever she had allegedly broken. She would have signed any document placed in front of her without reading a single paragraph, just to restore the artificial harmony of the family unit. But that girl was gone. She was buried under layers of independence, corporate authority, and cold, hard data. I knew Wyatt's default notices had hit the county courts. I knew the creditors were preparing to seize his assets. I knew my parents needed my physical signature on a quitclaim deed to steal my grandfather's land and halt the impending bankruptcy. The fabricated pregnancy complication was the only excuse they could invent to justify demanding my immediate physical presence in a specific location. They chose Aunt Rhonda's sprawling estate because it offered a controlled environment, a fortress where they outnumbered me and could dictate the terms of the surrender. They expected a panicked, obedient child to walk through those doors. I intended to introduce them to the architect of their destruction. I walked into my bedroom and opened the closet. I bypassed the heavy canvas work gear and the steel-toed boots I wore on the extraction sites. I reached for a tailored charcoal blazer and a pair of sharp-pressed trousers. I selected a crisp white button-down shirt, fastening the cuffs with deliberate, precise movements. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, unyielding knot. I paused in front of the full-length mirror. The reflection staring back at me was formidable. The posture was rigid, the shoulders squared, the jaw set in a line of carved granite. I looked like a woman who commanded heavy machinery and directed millions of dollars in subterranean resources. I did not look like a victim. I did not look like someone who could be extorted. The visual armor was essential. I was preparing to step onto a battlefield, and I wanted my enemies to recognize their miscalculation the second they looked into my eyes. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up the heavy black binder Elias Keller and I had assembled. The thick leather cover felt cool against my palms. The 5 pounds of paper inside represented the total annihilation of my family's fraudulent empire. I tucked the binder under my arm, grabbed my keys, and walked out the front door. The morning air was freezing, biting at my exposed skin as I climbed into the cab of my truck. The engine roared to life, a deep, comforting rumble that vibrated through the steering wheel. I shifted into gear and pulled out of the driveway, leaving the quiet isolation of my cabin behind. The drive took 40 minutes. The route transitioned from the rugged, unfiltered beauty of the high plains into the manicured artificiality of Casper's most exclusive suburban enclave. The transition always felt jarring. The jagged limestone ridges and sprawling sagebrush gave way to wrought iron gates, pristine sidewalks, and towering faux colonial facades. This was a neighborhood built on appearances, a monument to credit limits and social posturing. I navigated the winding streets until I reached the entrance to Aunt Rhonda's estate. The property was a sprawling brick manor flanked by towering evergreen trees and a pristine, frost-covered lawn. But as I pulled my truck up to the curb, a glaring anomaly broke the narrative my parents had carefully constructed. Joanne claimed this was a desperate medical emergency. She claimed Kinsley was suffering a severe complication requiring quiet rest and immediate familial support. Yet the sprawling circular driveway was packed with vehicles. I put my truck in park and surveyed the scene. There were at least 20 cars lining the pristine concrete and spilling over onto the street. These were not ambulances or medical transport vehicles. They were gleaming European imports, luxury sports utility vehicles, and high-end sedans. I recognized the cars belonging to my parents' country club friends, Wyatt's business associates, and Aunt Rhonda's affluent social circle. The sheer volume of vehicles told a story that directly contradicted the frantic voicemail. A family dealing with a sudden, terrifying pregnancy complication does not invite 30 high society guests over for morning coffee. My analytical mind processed the anomaly instantly. The medical emergency was not just a lie, it was a decoy. They had orchestrated a massive social gathering. They intended to corner me in front of an audience. They calculated that the intense pressure of a crowd, combined with the watchful eyes of their wealthy peers, would force me to sign the documents just to avoid causing a public scene. They weaponized my historical aversion to conflict, hoping I would shrink away and surrender my inheritance rather than risk embarrassing them in front of their friends. I turned off the ignition. The heavy engine of my truck sputtered and died, leaving a dense silence in the cabin. I looked at the grand double doors of the brick manor. Behind that varnished wood, my parents were waiting. They were smiling and hosting, believing they had backed me into a corner I could not escape. They believed they held all the leverage. I reached across the console and picked up the thick black binder. The metal rings clicked softly as I adjusted my grip. I stepped out of the truck, and my boots met the frozen pavement with a sharp, definitive crunch. The frigid Wyoming wind whipped around me, snapping the edges of my charcoal blazer. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the familiar suffocating anxiety that used to accompany any interaction with my family. I felt a profound, icy clarity. I walked up the winding brick pathway, placing one foot in front of the other with measured, deliberate purpose. The luxury cars flanked me on either side, monuments to the very debt Wyatt was drowning in. I reached the wide stone porch and stopped at the threshold. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the freezing air. I gripped the binder, tightening my fingers around the leather spine. I reached out, turned the heavy brass handle, and pushed open the front doors, stepping directly into the lion's den. The heavy mahogany doors yielded to my push, revealing a scene that defied every frantic voicemail I had received. A blast of heated air washed over me, carrying the cloying scent of vanilla fondant and expensive floral arrangements. I stepped into a literal wall of pastel pink and powder blue balloons arching gracefully over the grand foyer. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings, blending with the soft notes of a hired string quartet playing in the corner. Crystal champagne flutes clinked in the hands of 50 high society guests, mingling on the polished marble floor. There were no paramedics. There were no hushed, worried whispers praying for a safe delivery. The catastrophic medical emergency was a total fabrication. It was a lavish baby shower. Standing in the center of the sunken living room, bathed in the warm glow of a crystal chandelier, was my cousin. Kinsley was miraculously cured of her fabricated blood pressure spike. She wore a custom silk maternity gown that draped perfectly over her frame, holding court among a tight circle of affluent country club wives. She beamed with radiant health, accepting wrapped boxes tied in silver ribbons with theatrical gratitude. This was the relative who had never worked a single grueling day in her life, funded by my parents' quiet desperation while I surveyed frozen dirt to pay my college tuition. The sheer artificiality of the room contrasted sharply with the rugged, unfiltered reality of the Wyoming basins I navigated daily. I stood at the edge of the foyer, gripping the thick black leather binder under my arm, letting the truth wash over me. It took only seconds for the perimeter defense to activate. Joanne and Dennis spotted me from their post near the sprawling catering table, their faces drained of color, transitioning from smug satisfaction to stark terror in a fraction of a second. They rapidly contorted their features into tight, panicked smiles meant to placate the surrounding guests who might notice my arrival. They moved toward me with synchronized, frantic urgency, weaving through the crowd of wealthy attendees like sharks navigating a shallow reef. "Carrie, darling, you made it," Joanne cooed loudly, ensuring the women sipping mimosas nearby heard her maternal greeting. But the moment she reached me, her fingers clamped around my bicep like a steel vise. Dennis flanked my other side, his grip equally punishing on my left shoulder. They did not hug me, they steered me. They practically dragged me away from the bright, crowded living room, forcing my momentum down a dark, narrow hallway toward the back of the sprawling estate. The cheerful music faded with every step, replaced by the heavy, synchronized thud of our boots on the hardwood floor. Aunt Rhonda's private dining room felt suffocating. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the crisp winter sun, plunging the space into dim, oppressive shadows. The air was stagnant, smelling of old wood polish and nervous sweat. Two strangers sat rigidly at the long, polished table. One was a middle-aged woman clutching a brass notary stamp, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit. The other was a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, his collar dark with perspiration. He clutched a battered leather briefcase, looking exactly like a corrupt local loan officer who had been promised a significant under-the-table bonus to push through fraudulent paperwork on a weekend morning. The scene was set for a quiet, untraceable extortion. Dennis shoved me forward, causing me to stumble slightly before catching my balance. He quickly turned and closed the double doors behind us. The sharp click of the brass latch severed the remaining party noise, leaving only the sound of the loan officer breathing heavily. In the center of the mahogany table rested the trap. It was a dense, 100-page commercial lending contract. The pages were perfectly aligned, adorned with little yellow sticky notes pointing directly to the required signature lines. The trap was primed, waiting for the obedient victim to step into the steel jaws. Joanne positioned herself blocking the exit, crossing her arms over her chest. Dennis walked to the head of the table. He picked up a heavy silver pen and shoved it directly into my palm. He leaned in close, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale coffee and desperation. His voice dropped to a fierce, venomous whisper. We do not have time for your games today. Sign it, Carrie, or you are no longer part of this family. You will be dead to us." The threat hung in the stagnant air. A year ago, those words would have shattered my heart. I would have traded everything I owned just to keep my place at their table. But the woman holding the pen was a geological surveyor who mapped subterranean fault lines and commanded heavy machinery. I analyzed the geometry of the room, the legal weight of the binder tucked under my arm, and the pathetic desperation of a father trying to sell his daughter to save his own pride. I shifted my gaze away from my father. I looked at the notary public. She looked down at her lap, clearly ashamed of her role in this backroom deal, realizing she was facilitating an ambush. I looked at the loan officer. He wiped his damp forehead with a crumpled handkerchief, avoiding my eyes entirely. I looked at Joanne, trembling by the door, terrified that her high society friends might discover the rot hiding behind the velvet curtains. Finally, I brought my eyes back to Dennis. I adjusted my grip on the silver pen. The metal felt cool and heavy against my calloused skin. I placed my left hand flat on top of the dense stack of paper. I did not flip to the back page where the yellow tab waited for my submission. I used my thumb to fan the heavy stock paper, counting the numbers printed in the bottom corner of each sheet. I moved with slow, deliberate precision, making them wait in agonizing silence. I stopped precisely on page 74. The quitclaim deed. I planted my boots firmly on the hardwood floor, rooting myself like the granite peaks of the Tetons. I kept my hand flat on the exposed deed and looked my father dead in the eye. The arrogant sneer on his face began to falter, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. I drew a deep, steadying breath into my lungs, preparing a vocal projection designed to cut through thick timber and heavy doors. I did not whisper. I did not negotiate. I unleashed my voice, letting the volume and authority shatter the quiet extortion room. Why does this medical debt consolidation include a collateral transfer of Grandpa's land to Wyatt's LLC? The blood drained from my father's face faster than water vanishing into parched sandstone. The arrogant sneer he wore just seconds prior dissolved into a chalky gray mask of sheer panic. He lunged forward across the mahogany table, his hands grasping at the empty air, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He expected me to cower under his hushed threats. He expected the ingrained conditioning of my childhood to force my silence. He calculated wrong. I did not lower my voice. I did not shrink back into the shadows of the velvet-draped dining room. I tightened my grip on the thick leather binder, pivoted on my heel, and grabbed the heavy brass handles of the double doors. I pushed them outward with every ounce of strength I possessed. The doors swung open, striking the hallway walls with a sharp, echoing crack. I marched out of the dark, stagnant corridor and stepped directly into the bright, sunlit center of the sprawling living room. The sudden intrusion shattered the delicate ambiance of the gathering. In the corner, the cellist of the hired string quartet dragged his bow across the strings, hitting a harsh, sour note before the entire ensemble ground to a halt. The cheerful chatter evaporated. 50 high society guests, draped in expensive cashmere and tailored suits, turned in unison to stare at the woman in the charcoal blazer, crashing their pristine afternoon. Crystal champagne flutes froze midair. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates ceased entirely. The silence that fell over the room was heavy and charged, like the atmospheric drop right before a high plains thunderstorm. I did not hesitate. I walked straight past the towering floral arrangements and the catered towers of artisanal pastries, my boots thudding against the polished marble floor. I headed directly for the extravagant gift table, a sprawling display of designer baby items, silver frames, and pastel boxes, wrapped in silk ribbons. I raised my heavy black binder and dropped it squarely onto the center of the table. The impact landed with a deafening thud. The sound rattled the delicate china plates stacked nearby. A silver rattle bounced off the edge of the table and clattered onto the floor. The noise jolted the audience, snapping them out of their stunned trance. Joanne and Dennis stumbled out of the hallway behind me, their faces twisted in horror. My mother reached out, her voice a frantic, desperate whisper, begging me to stop, pleading with me to think of their guests. But I was not thinking of their guests. I was utilizing them. I needed witnesses. I flipped open the heavy metal rings of my binder. I reached into the second tab and pulled out a thick stack of Wyatt's hidden financial records. I turned to locate my cousin's husband. The golden son-in-law stood near the ornate stone fireplace, wearing a tailored blazer and holding a crystal tumbler of bourbon. For years, my parents had paraded Wyatt around this exact group of people, boasting about his visionary business acumen and his thriving luxury outfitting company. They sold an image of unshakable wealth and prestige. I decided to introduce his true resume to his friends. Since we are gathered here today to celebrate the future, I announced, pitching my voice to reach every corner of the vaulted room, I thought everyone should know exactly how this family is funding it. I held up the first set of documents, pointing to the red ink, detailing the staggering commercial debt. I exposed the reality of the guided hunting leases. I revealed the defaulted equipment loans and the frantic unpaid vendor invoices. I explained that Wyatt was not a visionary entrepreneur, but a drowning man hurtling toward an inevitable Chapter 7 bankruptcy. A collective gasp rippled through the affluent crowd. The country club wives exchanged wide-eyed, scandalized glances. The business partners, who had invested their social capital in Wyatt, stepped back, putting physical distance between themselves and the man by the fireplace. Wyatt's face turned a brilliant shade of crimson, his jaw clenching as he stared at the floor, unable to refute the hard data printed on the pages I held. But I was far from finished. I pulled out the forensic accounting ledgers. "He is not just a failed businessman," I continued, my tone sharp and unforgiving. "He is a thief. For the past 4 years, Wyatt has systematically embezzled the retirement funds of the very people hosting this party." I displayed the bank statements showing the direct routing numbers transferring Joanne and Dennis's life savings into dummy corporate accounts controlled by their beloved son-in-law. The truth hung in the air, toxic and undeniable. To protect the pastel illusion of Kinsley's flawless marriage, my parents had mortgaged their home and sacrificed their own security to cover for a criminal. And when the well ran dry, they tried to steal my grandfather's land to keep the charade alive. Kinsley could not handle the exposure. The spotlight she craved her entire life was suddenly burning her alive. She stepped forward, her designer maternity gown swishing around her ankles. Her face was flushed with a bright, blotchy humiliation. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "Shut up!" Kinsley screamed, her voice cracking, shedding the refined persona she wore for the crowd. "Stop talking! You are ruining my day! You are just a jealous, bitter loser trying to destroy my family." She stomped her foot, throwing a frantic, desperate tantrum in front of 50 stunned spectators. It was a pathetic display, a final attempt to reclaim control through sheer volume, but I remained relentless. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I did not shrink away. I maintained a cool, clinical detachment, letting her unhinged behavior contrast against my undeniable evidence. I ignored her screaming and pivoted toward the archway. The sweaty loan officer and the nervous notary had crept out of the private dining room, hovering near the edge of the foyer, searching desperately for a quiet exit. I reached into the binder and extracted the final set of papers. I pulled out the official credit freeze documentation and the logs demonstrating the forged digital signature used to initiate the commercial loan pre-approval. I walked toward the terrified banker, holding the evidence up for him to read. "You brought a 100-page contract into this house, expecting me to sign a quit-claim deed," I said, my voice echoing off the marble walls. But the foundational application securing that loan was initiated using a stolen Social Security number and a forged electronic signature. The loan officer narrowed his eyes, tracking the printed lines of the fraud alert. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly under the chandelier light. "This loan is based on federal wire fraud," I announced to the silent room, ensuring every guest heard the precise legal terminology, "and anyone facilitating the execution of these documents is acting as an accessory to identity theft and grand larceny." The threat of federal prison time shattered whatever corrupt loyalty the banker possessed. He realized instantly that my parents had dragged him into a highly illegal scheme, and the paper trail was already established. Panic overtook his features. He snatched his battered briefcase from the floor, clutching it tightly to his chest. He did not say a word to Dennis. He did not look back. He turned and sprinted toward the front doors, shoving past a group of stunned guests to save his banking license and his own freedom. The notary public reacted with identical terror. She let out a small, terrified squeak, frantically sweeping her brass stamp and ink pad into her purse. She practically ran down the hallway, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood, eager to escape the blast radius of the collapsing fraud scheme. The heavy oak front doors slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a gavel striking a judge's bench. I stood in the center of the foyer, surrounded by a sea of pastel balloons and discarded champagne glasses. The silence that followed the exodus was profound. I looked at Joanne, who had collapsed onto a velvet armchair, sobbing into her hands as the reality of her social ruin washed over her. I looked at Dennis, standing frozen, stripped of his patriarchal authority, his reputation decimated in front of his wealthy peers. I looked at Kinsley, weeping silently near the fireplace, as her high society friends whispered and began edging toward the coat closet, eager to distance themselves from the toxic fallout. The carefully constructed pastel facade of my family's superiority lay in jagged, irreparable pieces across the floor. They had spent decades judging my worth, erasing my achievements, and demanding my compliance to fund their delusions. They assumed I was nothing more than useful dirt. They were wrong. I was bedrock, and I had just broken their entire world. The echo of the heavy oak doors slamming shut seemed to sever the invisible strings that had animated my mother for the past 26 years. Without the corrupt loan officer and the fleeing notary to process her salvation, Joanne comprehended the sheer magnitude of her exposure. The facade cracked, and the frantic, polished suburban matriarch dissolved into a picture of primal terror. She lunged forward, bridging the gap between the catered buffet and the foyer in 3 uncoordinated strides. Her hands reached out, fingers hooking into the fabric of my charcoal blazer. Real, panicked tears spilled down her cheeks, carving dark tracks through her expensive foundation. "Carrie, please," she sobbed, her voice a ragged, breathless plea that lacked any of its usual theatrical polish. "You have to help us. You heard what that banker said. They are going to call the federal authorities. We will go to prison. Just sign the deed. We can draft a new contract later. We can pay you back. Just save your father and me." I looked down at her hands gripping my lapels. For a brief, fleeting second, a ghost of the neglected child inside me stirred, programmed to soothe her distress. I extinguished that ghost instantly. I reached up and peeled her fingers off my jacket one by one with a cold, detached precision. I smiled. It was not a gesture of warmth. It was a sharp, satisfied expression born from months of calculated endurance. "You still think this is a negotiation?" I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "You still believe you hold enough leverage to dictate terms." I turned my attention back to the heavy black binder resting on the gift table, surrounded by piles of imported tissue paper and luxury infant toys. I flipped past the embezzlement ledgers and the wire fraud statutes. I reached the final tab, extracting a single crisp sheet of legal paper bearing the official seal of the Wyoming Secretary of State. I held the document up, ensuring the crest caught the light of the crystal chandelier. I addressed Dennis, who stood frozen near the fireplace, looking like a hollowed-out shell of the tyrant he used to be. "For over a decade, you mocked my grandfather's inheritance," I began, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "You called that acreage useless dirt. You deemed it a barren tax burden because you never bothered to look beneath the surface. You only decided to steal it today because you figured it held just enough baseline agricultural equity to appease Wyatt's hungry creditors." I took a slow, deliberate step toward my father. "I am a geological surveyor," I continued, letting the weight of my profession hang in the air. "I do not guess. I analyze data. 2 days ago, I ran a classified topographical rendering on those exact coordinates. Your useless dirt sits directly atop a high-yield geothermal reservoir, heavily interwoven with dysprosium and neodymium veins. The affluent guests in the room were not geologists, but they were venture capitalists, real estate developers, and corporate executives. They understood the terminology. They knew exactly what rare earth minerals meant in the modern industrial economy. A collective, staggered intake of breath echoed from a group of men standing near the patio doors. "That barren scrubland is currently valued in the mid-8 figures," I stated, driving the final nail into their coffin. "It is a multi-million-dollar energy asset, and you tried to siphon it away to cover the debts of a failing luxury outfitter who has been robbing you blind." Dennis staggered backward, his spine hitting the stone mantel of the fireplace. His eyes widened, pupils dilating as the true financial magnitude of what he had just missed stealing crashed down upon him. He could have been wealthy beyond his wildest suburban dreams. Instead, his greed and his blind devotion to Kinsley's artificial status had cost him everything. Joanne let out a low, guttural wail, sinking to her knees on the polished marble floor. I turned the document around, displaying the finalized incorporation signatures. "But your biggest miscalculation was assuming I would remain passive," I said softly, ensuring every single guest heard the unwavering finality in my voice. "I executed this paperwork at 6:14 yesterday morning. I transferred the deed, the subterranean rights, and the surface leases into an irrevocable corporate shield named Basin Apex Holdings." I looked at Wyatt, whose face had gone dangerously pale. "I am the sole executor," I declared. "The entity is locked. It contains anti-coercion bylaws. No creditor, no relative, and no fraudulent lending institution can ever compel a transfer of ownership. You cannot steal an asset I no longer own." The checkmate was total. The trap I had walked into was now a cage of their own making, and I had just melted down the only key. Aunt Rhonda, sensing the irreparable destruction of her pristine social standing, finally found her voice. She stepped out from behind a towering arrangement of white hydrangeas, her face pinched in fury. Her tailored dress trembled as she pointed a manicured finger toward the foyer. "Get out of my house," she sputtered, her voice shrill and quivering. "You have done enough damage here today. Leave immediately." I turned to face her, maintaining my calm, unbothered posture. "Gladly," I replied, offering her a polite, devastating nod. "But before you focus on cleaning up this party, you should probably consult legal counsel. I flagged the forged commercial application yesterday morning. The bank's fraud department is already building a formal case, and they have the digital footprint tracing right back to your brother's home network." I did not wait to watch the remaining color drain from Aunt Rhonda's face. I walked over to the gift table, leaving the heavy black binder sitting prominently next to a stack of cashmere baby blankets. It was a monument to their deceit, a permanent record of their crimes left behind for every high society guest to peruse at their leisure. I turned my back on the wreckage and walked out the front doors. The transition from the stifling, perfume-laden air of the manor to the freezing, crisp Wyoming wind felt like drawing my first real breath in 26 years. The silence outside was striking. The heavy oak doors remained shut behind me, sealing my family inside their own self-created prison. I walked down the winding brick pathway, passing the fleet of luxury vehicles that now felt like tombstones marking the end of Wyatt's fraudulent empire. I climbed into the cab of my truck, the leather seat cold against my back. I inserted the key, and the heavy engine roared to life, a deep, comforting vibration that grounded me in reality. I shifted into gear and pulled away from the curb. I did not check the rearview mirror. As I navigated the winding suburban streets, heading back toward the open highway, an immense, crushing weight lifted off my shoulders. For my entire life, I had carried the burden of their expectations, their conditional love, and their relentless demands for compliance. I had twisted myself into knots trying to earn a seat at a table where I was only valued as a disposable resource. That burden was gone. I merged onto the interstate, pointing the nose of my truck toward Casper. The manicured lawns and faux colonial facades faded away, replaced by the rugged, unfiltered beauty of the High Plains basins. The jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains loomed on the horizon, unbothered by the trivial, artificial dramas of the suburbs. I had walked directly into their trap, armed with undeniable data and an unyielding spine, and I had dismantled their illusion piece by piece. I left them trapped in the rubble of their unparalleled greed, facing federal investigations, imminent foreclosures, and the total annihilation of their social standing. The stage was set for a spectacular collapse, and I was perfectly content to watch the fallout from a very safe, very lucrative distance. The fallout struck with the sudden, devastating velocity of a High Plains avalanche. Once the local lending institution confirmed the digital footprint of the forged signatures, the underwriters did not merely deny the commercial refinancing application, they triggered a catastrophic financial chain reaction. The fraud investigation formally alerted federal authorities, prompting the Bank Risk Management Division to immediately call in Joanne and Dennis' existing primary mortgages. American financial institutions possess zero tolerance for clients who attempt to secure funding through felony identity theft. The demand letters arrived via certified mail, giving my parents 30 days to pay the principal balances in full or face total asset forfeiture. They did not possess the capital to satisfy the banks. The money was already gone, siphoned away by Wyatt's relentless embezzlement. When the federal wire fraud indictments formally dropped, the austere reality of the American justice system crushed whatever remaining arrogance my father harbored. Defending against federal charges requires elite criminal defense attorneys, and those legal experts demand exorbitant retainers paid up front in cleared funds. To secure their legal representation and attempt to negotiate a plea deal that might keep them out of a federal penitentiary, Joanne and Dennis were forced into a fire sale. They liquidated everything they owned. The sprawling suburban manor with its vaulted ceilings and manicured lawns was surrendered to the bank. The luxury sport utility vehicles were repossessed in the middle of the night by silent tow trucks. My parents relocated to a cramped, dilapidated apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of Casper. It was a bleak concrete structure overlooking a busy freight train artery, bathed in the harsh orange glow of sodium streetlights. The rusted mailboxes hanging off the wall and the cracked asphalt in the parking lot served as daily reminders of their precipitous fall from grace. There were no country club galas in this neighborhood. There were no wealthy neighbors to impress. They were trapped in a tiny, drafty unit, breathing in the scent of cheap linoleum and stale cigarette smoke left by previous tenants. Their social standing evaporated overnight, leaving them isolated in the wreckage of their own unparalleled greed. The destruction extended directly to the Golden couple. Wyatt officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection, making a desperate maneuver to shield himself from the hordes of furious creditors he had defrauded. The court-appointed trustees descended upon his luxury outfitting company, seizing the guided hunting leases, the high-end camping gear, and the remaining company assets to auction off for pennies on the dollar. The glossy facade of the visionary entrepreneur shattered, revealing a pathetic con artist facing his own separate federal inquiries. Kinsley lost her safety net instantly. The designer maternity gowns and the catered champagne showers vanished, replaced by the grim mathematics of survival. Stripped of her unearned luxury, my cousin faced a harsh awakening. With Wyatt tangled in endless litigation and her parents bankrupted, Kinsley was forced to enter the workforce for the first time in her pampered existence. She secured a minimum wage position at a big box retail store on the opposite side of the county. She had to learn how to punch a time clock, answer to demanding shift supervisors, and navigate the exhaustion of manual labor. The woman who once held court at exclusive brunches now spent her days standing on bruised feet under flickering fluorescent lights, scanning barcodes and folding clearance apparel for ungrateful customers. The sheer poetry of her new reality was striking. The golden child, who believed she was destined for a life of effortless royalty, was relegated to a polyester uniform and a rigid break schedule. The climax of this geographic redistribution occurred 3 months later. The commercial real estate holding Wyatt former outfitting headquarters was formally foreclosed upon by the lending syndicate. The bank scheduled a public auction on the steps of the Natrona County Courthouse to liquidate the commercial lot. I attended the auction on a crisp Tuesday morning wearing my tailored charcoal blazer and a quiet, satisfied demeanor. The property was expansive, featuring a sprawling timber-framed lodge and several acres of reinforced concrete parking. It was a prime piece of industrial real estate, previously wasted on selling an illusion of rugged affluence to wealthy tourists. Bidding started exceptionally low. The local real estate market was experiencing a slight dip, and the property carried the undeniable taint of Wyatt highly publicized scandals. A few local developers raised their paddles, but I methodically outbid them, maintaining a cool, clinical detachment. I utilized the capital generated by my newly established geothermal extraction firm, Basin Apex Holdings. When the auctioneer gavel finally struck the wooden podium, I secured the entire commercial lot at a staggering discount. I had literally bought out the physical manifestation of their failed empire. I did not keep the rustic faux luxury aesthetic. I hired a demolition crew the very next week. Watching the wrecking ball smash through the ornate glass facade provided a deep, visceral satisfaction. We gutted the timber-framed lodge, tearing down the mounted elk heads, the imported leather seating, and the expansive tasting bars. We ripped out the polished hardwood floors, replacing them with reinforced industrial-grade concrete designed to withstand immense weight. The sprawling building was transformed from a monument of fake suburban prestige into a highly functional heavy machinery storage garage. It became the central operational hub for my booming geothermal firm. Where Wyatt once hosted high society investors, I now parked mud-caked drilling rigs, seismic testing trucks, and deep earth core excavators. The smell of expensive bourbon and expensive cologne was permanently replaced by the honest, unfiltered scent of diesel fuel hydraulic fluid and raw Wyoming dirt. They had actively conspired to ruin my future, attempting to steal the very ground beneath my feet to sustain their lies. In a stroke of profound poetic justice, I utilized the wealth generated by that exact piece of land to purchase their foreclosed territory. During this period of intense expansion, my phone occasionally registered blocked calls and filtered voicemails. Joanne and Dennis attempted to reach out, leaving pathetic, weeping apologies on my digital answering service. They claimed they recognized their catastrophic mistakes and that they desperately wanted to heal our fractured family dynamic. Kinsley even sent a lengthy, misspelled email blaming her husband for the entire conspiracy and begging for a financial loan to help cover her basic living expenses. I did not respond to a single inquiry. I did not entertain their frantic backpedaling. I blocked every new number they managed to procure, routing their emails directly into a permanently deleted folder. The time for negotiations ended the moment they slid that forged quitclaim deed across the mahogany dining table. I focused entirely on the burgeoning empire I was building. Basin Apex Holdings secured a lucrative federal grant to expand our rare earth mineral surveying operations. My days were filled with negotiating extraction leases, analyzing subterranean thermal maps, and directing fleets of specialized equipment across the High Plains. I was hiring new geologists, securing governmental contracts, and cementing my status as a titan in the Western energy sector. The noise of their destruction faded into the background, eclipsed by the roaring engines of my extraction fleet. 6 months passed. The harsh Wyoming winter yielded to a brittle, brilliant spring. I stood on the highest ridge of the basin, the exact coordinate point my parents once tried to steal. The wind howled across the high plains, a relentless scouring force that bent the sagebrush flat against the cracked earth. I wore a heavy canvas jacket and thick leather work gloves, my boots planted firmly in the chalky soil. The air up here was thin and sharp, carrying the distinct metallic scent of heated rock and fresh ozone. Before me stretched a valley of raw, unfiltered power. The jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Grand Tetons loomed in the distance, their granite spires piercing the vivid blue sky like jagged teeth. They stood as silent sentinels, unbothered by the trivial concerns of the world below. I found a profound comfort in their enduring permanence. Down in the basin, the operational heart of Basin Apex Holdings pulsed with life. A towering geothermal drilling rig dominated the landscape, its steel lattice structure gleaming in the morning sun. The deep, rhythmic thrum of the subterranean turbine reverberated through the soles of my boots. It was a tangible vibration, a heartbeat born from the core of the planet. Plumes of white steam vented into the crisp atmosphere, marking the exact locations where we were drawing clean, limitless energy from the ancient heat trapped beneath the bedrock. Further down the ridge, a fleet of specialized excavators worked in orchestrated harmony, carefully mapping the rare earth mineral veins I had identified months ago. The heavy machinery moved with deliberate precision, extracting dysprosium and neodymium from the rocky crust. The site was a symphony of industrial progress, governed by hard data, structural integrity, and relentless endurance. I walked along the ridgeline, tracing the perimeter of my grandfather's legacy. He had stood on this very spot decades ago, looking out over the desolate expanse. He lacked the satellite telemetry and thermal imaging software I now employed, but he possessed a bone-deep intuition. He knew the earth harbored secrets. He recognized that the most valuable assets rarely announce themselves on the surface. They require digging. They require patience. They require a willingness to look past the barren exterior. My parents spent their entire lives obsessed with the surface. They worshipped manicured lawns, designer labels, and the fragile approval of country club peers. They judged the worth of this land by its inability to grow lush green grass, dismissing it as a tax burden. They judged my worth by my refusal to conform to their shallow expectations, dismissing my academic achievements because a geology degree did not sparkle enough for their social circles. Their obsession with appearances ultimately blinded them to the wealth sitting right beneath their feet, both literally and figuratively. They traded a multi-million-dollar inheritance for the illusion of a successful son-in-law, and in the end, they were left holding nothing but ashes. A sharp vibration in my right pocket broke my concentration. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket. The screen illuminated the dim shadow cast by my hard hat. Incoming call. Blocked number. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. The local courts had finalized the bankruptcy proceedings earlier that week. The eviction notices for the dilapidated apartment complex were likely looming, as the legal retainers drained whatever meager funds Joanne and Dennis managed to scrape together from their fire sale. They were dialing my number from a prepaid burner phone, hoping to bypass the digital barricades I had erected. They were likely sitting in that cramped, nicotine-stained living room, rehearsing a new script of apologies, praying that the passage of time had softened my resolve. They hoped the daughter who used to crave their affection would answer the call, ready to write a check and grant them absolution. I stared at the glowing screen, observing the flashing digits with a cold, clinical detachment. Months ago, a call like this would have triggered a spike of adrenaline. It would have ignited a war in my chest between the ingrained guilt of my childhood and the righteous anger of my betrayal. I would have felt the burning urge to answer, to demand explanations, to twist the knife, or to scream into the receiver until my throat turned raw. Now, I felt nothing. The emotional reservoir they used to drain was dry. The anger had crystallized into a serene, untouchable peace. I swiped my thumb across the glass, declining the call. The screen went dark, returning my reflection in the polished surface. I slid the device back into my pocket, dismissing their frantic desperation with the same effortless motion I used to brush a fleck of dust from my sleeve. True victory, I realized, did not reside in their destruction. Their public humiliation at the baby shower, the foreclosure of the luxury outfitting lodge, the federal wire fraud indictments, these were simply the natural consequences of their own toxic arithmetic. The real triumph was the profound silence that followed. The victory was standing on this windswept ridge, feeling the raw power of the earth humming beneath my feet, and knowing I owed them nothing. I built an empire from the dirt they threw away. I turned my trauma into a foundation of solid granite. I established a scholarship fund at the University of Wyoming, channeling a portion of the geothermal profits to support geology students who lacked familial backing. I ensured that the next generation of scientists would not have to face a row of empty folding chairs on their graduation day. I replaced the hollow ache of my past with a legacy of tangible, undeniable worth. I want to pause for a moment and speak directly to you, the person listening to this story. Maybe you are sitting in a room right now, surrounded by people who claim to love you, but only acknowledge your existence when you can provide them with a service. Maybe you are bending over backward, shrinking your ambitions and silencing your own voice just to keep the peace at a dinner table where you are treated as an afterthought. Maybe you are financing the illusions of a golden child, or absorbing the blame for mistakes you never made, all because you were taught that blood dictates loyalty. If you are sitting at a table where you are only valued for what can be extracted from you, it is time to get up and walk away. You do not owe anyone your future, especially not the people who refuse to celebrate your past. You are not a disposable resource. You are not a human shield designed to absorb the consequences of someone else's greed. Setting a boundary is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of survival. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is look at the empty chairs, acknowledge the profound failure of the people who were supposed to fill them, and decide to walk the stage anyway. Sometimes you have to pack your bags, cut the ties, and drive toward the mountains. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the freezing, pristine Wyoming air. The wind whipped my hair around my face, a wild, untamed force that felt like an embrace. Below me, the extraction fleet continued its relentless, orchestrated dance. The trap was sprung, the emotional debt was canceled, and the useless dirt was finally mine. I turned my back on the valley and walked toward my truck, ready to survey the next horizon. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to build your own table because the one you were given was broken, drop a comment below, share your journey, hit the like button, subscribe to Grape Echo Stories, and remember, the real value is always beneath the surface. Stay strong, and until next time, protect your peace. We are raised on a very specific, deeply ingrained diet of American mythology regarding the nuclear family. From our earliest days, we are handed a script that dictates blood is an unbreakable bond, that a mother's love is inherently unconditional, and that parents are the ultimate architects of our moral and emotional sanctuaries. We are taught to believe that within the traditional family structure, there is always a safety net. But the story of Carrie Carter, a brilliant geologist who was forced to outmaneuver her own parents to protect her inheritance and her sanity, shatters that pastel-colored illusion. It forces us to confront a terrifying, unspoken truth about American domestic life. Sometimes, the people who brought you into this world are the very predators you must spend your adulthood escaped. The main lesson echoing from Carrie's desolate graduation day and the explosive baby shower isn't merely a tale of financial fraud or real estate triumph. It is a profound, harrowing masterclass in the catastrophic consequences of parenting without honesty, fairness, or emotional awareness. In our culture, there is a dangerous tendency to conflate parenting with performing. Carrie's parents, Joanne and Dennis, represent the darkest manifestation of this suburban theater. They built their identities around the fragile, artificial facade of country club prestige and the illusion of the perfect family embodied by their golden niece, Kinsley, and her con artist husband, Wyatt. To Joanne and Dennis, children were not independent souls, requiring long-term guidance, empathy, and moral cultivation. Rather, children were either props to be displayed for social currency or disposable assets to be leveraged when the bills came due. When Joanne sent that text on Carrie's graduation day, "It's just a diploma, this is a baby," she was not simply choosing one family event over another. She was broadcasting a toxic parenting value system where superficial milestones utterly eclipse genuine, hard-earned character. Carrie had spent years studying the tectonic plates of the earth, yet she was forced to navigate the far more treacherous fault lines of a family that refused to see her. Emotional awareness in parenting requires the courage to look at your child and recognize their intrinsic worth, separate from how their achievements reflect back on you. Because Joanne and Dennis lacked this fundamental emotional intelligence, they remained hopelessly blind to the formidable, brilliant woman they had raised. They looked at Carrie and saw only useless dirt. This failure of fairness is the rot that destroys traditional family structures from the inside out. True family responsibility is not about bailing out a criminal son-in-law to save face at the country club. It is about equitable love. When parents designate a golden child and a scapegoat, they are not building a family, they are building a cartel. The lengths to which Joanne and Dennis went, willingly committing federal wire fraud, embezzling, and attempting to steal Carrie's multi-million-dollar geothermal inheritance, prove that when parents prioritize social preservation over fundamental honesty, they will gladly eat their own young to stay alive. Yet nestled within this tragedy of parental failure is a quiet, beautiful testament to what long-term guidance truly looks like. It did not come from Carrie's parents, but from her grandfather. He saw the girl who played in the mud. He understood that she possessed the grit and the vision to look beneath the surface, both in the Wyoming basins and in the people around her. By leaving her that useless acreage, he was practicing the truest form of generational guidance. He did not give her a manicured lawn. He gave her a bedrock foundation. He equipped her with the tools to survive the very people who should have protected her. Stories like Carrie's are vital because they give us permission to speak the unspoken. They remind us that we are not alone in our quiet grief, and that setting boundaries with toxic bloodlines is not an act of betrayal, but the ultimate act of self-preservation. If you have ever found yourself examining the fractures in your own family tree, or if you have ever had to build your own table because the one you were given was broken, I invite you to become part of our community. Please take a moment to like this essay and subscribe to Grape Echo Stories. We are dedicated to sharing these profound, often hidden truths about the human experience, and your support helps us bring more of these empowering narratives into the light. Ultimately, Carrie's journey forces us to reevaluate our conventional understanding of duty and gratitude. We are conditioned by society to believe that we owe our parents our futures simply because they gave us our pasts. We are told that forgiveness is mandatory and that estrangement is a failure of the child's compassion. But I submit to you a radically different philosophy. The biological act of giving life does not grant a lifelong license for extortion. Sometimes, the most profound and liberating gift a toxic parent can ever give their child is their complete and utter failure. By abandoning Carrie at her graduation, by treating her with such callous, unvarnished greed, Joanne and Dennis accidentally set her free. They severed the heavy chains of familial obligation and daughterly guilt. When parents refuse to provide a safety net, they force their children to learn how to fly, or in Carrie's case, how to plant their boots firmly into the earth and move mountains. As we look at the wreckage of the Carter family, we are left with a quiet, lingering realization. The American dream promises us that a home is a place of unconditional safety. But perhaps true safety is never found in the house you were born into, nor in the approval you spent your childhood begging to receive. Perhaps true safety is the chilling, beautiful moment you look across a crowded, pastel-colored room, recognize the predators wearing the faces of your family, and realize you no longer need them to survive. You are left to wonder, as the dust settles on your own life, are you still sitting at a table waiting for empty chairs to be filled? Or are you finally ready to walk out the door and claim the earth that is already yours?